By reviewing the old, one comes to understand the new, says Confucius. Across civilizations, the pursuit of wisdom has often begun with a dialogue between past and present. The Second World Conference of Classics provided just such a platform. Held on June the 9th and 10th in Athens, Greece, the conference is jointly organized by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the Chinese Ministry of Education, the Chinese Ministry of Culture and Tourism, the Greek Ministry of Culture, and the Academy of Athens. The conference brings together scholars and experts from around the world to revisit some of humanity's oldest ideas. But what exactly are the messages the organizers hope to convey to the world? Why now? And why does it matter to us all? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Athens, Greece by Professor Zhang Yongle, Associate Professor of Law at Peking University and Academic Advisor at the Center for Classical and Medieval Studies of Peking University. From Munich, Germany, by Professor Hans van Es, former Vice President and Chair of Sinology at the University of Munich. And from Rome, Italy, by Giorgio Piraz, full Professor of Classical Philosophy in the Department of Ancient Sciences at Sapienza University of Rome. Gentlemen, the warmest welcome to all of you. First of all, to all those who are watching, let's help them understand exactly what we're talking about when we're saying the classics here, and why are we talking about this at this moment? Professor Zhang, let's start with you.
There are a narrow definition of classics and a broad definition of classics. I think the first word, a conference of classics, actually adopt a wider definition of classics. So here, classics are pretty much defined as a foundational text, idea, institutions, and those values that came together with the world's major civilizations were first taking shape. So they are the bedrock of each civilization. And they raised the big basic question that we all share as humans. And they set a super high bar. They are always open to new interpretations. So first of all, they have a very shaping effect. And then secondly is that they are always succeeded and reinterpreted all the time. So I think, they are very important today when we begin to think about, how the human being, how the different civilizations can coexist and co-prosper. So a deep understanding of the tradition of the classics for each civilization is very important.
Professor Hans van Es, when people think about the classics, they have some certain ideas about what they are. Now, what is China and Greece and the organizers of this conference trying to tell to the world? What are they trying to reinterpret or reestablish or establish as a new narrative?
Well, I guess the word classics is a very difficult one. For Chinese classics, this was actually invented by the Jesuits when they came in the 17th century to China. They selected a certain very small group of texts that they thought had a shaping influence on China and said, these we now call classics. The Chinese themselves didn't do that. They speak of canonical scriptures, CGTN, and other ancient texts, but they didn't speak of classics. It's a modern concept, but I think it's a very clever way now to say, in this point of time that we are in history, it's important that we have a common term for Western, Chinese, and some other civilizations to speak about our own past in order to better understand each other. There are many conflicts in this world currently, and some of them, I think, really come from not understanding each other. And I think the main goal of this conference is to help people to better understand each other. And to better understand each other, it's necessary to know each other's traditions.
Professor Piraz, do you agree with Professor van Es's answer just now? And if so, can you give us some concrete examples? For instance, what are people trying to shed light on as classical works in other parts of the world if we're going to talk about a broader and more accurate, objective understanding of classics of human beings as a whole?
you have to think that the Jesuits that Professor Van Hess mentioned were educated in Western classics. So they knew that the word classic derives from Latin. Classicus is one soldier of the first class. So that it is the point that the classics were examples to imitate, to follow, to reflect about. That was what the Jesuits had in mind at that point. And now normal people in Western, and for instance in Rome, in Italy, speak about classics as models to imitate, to have as examples to reflect, to think about, example of writing, for instance, masterworks, but also masterpieces, buildings and landscapes can be thought as classics. So classics in general in all the world are models and examples to follow, to think about. And they allow the people to reflect about their past, as has been said. So this is the central point. Each people, each nation has to reflect about its past. And this reflection could be taken together to a general confrontation about our past and about our human being.
Professor Zhang, why is China in particular placing so much emphasis on classical studies? And when China means classical studies, what exactly does it refer to?
Well, today I think China is promoting classical studies. There are different reasons. First, we are realizing more and more that our path to modernization is distinctively Chinese, and a lot of Western theorists just cannot fully explain it. To understand ourselves, we need to grasp the classical foundation underneath China's modern development. And second, a lot of modern problems need wisdom from classical sources to solve. So as long as China gets more and more developed, a lot of modern problems appears. Then we have the urgent need to go back to the classical wisdoms. And the third, as China pushes forward with building a community with a shared future for mankind, we have to dig deep into the classical heritage of all civilizations if we want to find ways for everyone to coexist and flourish. So I think these are,
Yeah,
these
Professor
are reasons
Zhang,
for us to...
Yeah, you mentioned something really interesting. For instance, the distinct cultural characteristics of Chinese civilization, which may not be shared by other countries. Can you give an example, for instance, and how can we help the world understand that something that's by and large Chinese?
Okay, for example, in China, we have a civilization which starts very early period of time and keeps very continuous and never break. And it is also a very large scale civilization with very large territory and a very large population. And so compared to many other different civilizations, which are divided into different states, coexist and conflict with each other, China for 1,000 years, we enjoyed such a big scale civilization. And this pretty much shaped our understanding of politics, society, and individual life. So today, when Chinese think about our own way of modernization, then we always think about there must be a kind of a very strong central government. And China also, for example, we have a very strong notion of secularism. In China, our local religion is not as powerful as in many other civilizations. I think all these are very important features of the Chinese civilization.
Professor Hans van Es, you are chair of sinology at the University of Munich, and you have been studying both the Chinese language. You're fluent in Chinese, actually, and you have been studying Chinese culture for decades. What do you think is the urgency and the necessity in helping the world understand not just Chinese culture, but other civilizations when we're talking about the diversity of the world?
Well, I mean, globalization is an important phenomenon that has not stopped. Civilizations are actually getting closer together all the time. So our Western world has been completely changing. But I have the impression that many Westerners still believe in their old traditions, which is a good thing. But they should know about the other civilizations and should know about how other people are dealing with the world, how they look at us. Before, I think in the Western world, people were not so much concerned with the view from outside on us. But today, I think the world really has changed and we have to learn this. And so, from my perspective, as far as my own civilization is concerned, it's quite clear why we have to do this right now. I think as far as China is concerned, it's also very important that it understands actually what does it mean to say Chinese socialism. What is Chinese about it, actually? It's not easy to say. I've been studying this for almost 45 years now, and I'm quite reluctant to say that I really know what the differences between us all are, but I'm sure they are there. Human beings tend to be the same because there are many things that we all have in common, but cultural traditions do have an influence. And I think that is important to discuss and to find out about.
Professor Piras, maybe there are people watching us in Africa or Latin America, North America, for instance, Oceania. What about them when we talk about classics? Do they also have a place in the big discussion, or is it just, you know, Chinese, Greek, Roman, Italian?
Yeah, that's a good question, because the point is that our very old civilization, in sense that civilization, they reflected about themselves since hundreds and hundreds of years, have a clear conception of the past. But you have to consider that the ancient, and I mean the ancient Greek and Romans, had a lot of confrontation with other peoples. They were open to confrontation, at least in Mediterranean, I mean, because of obviously of the limitation of technology, of traveling and so on. But they were absolutely open to other civilizations. Romans in particular, as they increased, they enlarged their empire, they confronted themselves with the new peoples, and they did not impose their culture and their customs on the others. They absorb them, but they not impose their culture. That is a very important example for us, for the confrontation with other civilization. They don't know ancient Greek and Roman civilization. That is the point. We have to be very open to confrontation, to other culture.
What do you mean confrontation? What do you mean they were open to confrontation to other cultures? Were you saying that they were eager and willing to learn, to interact with other cultures, or they were very, how should I say, they were very adventurous and they wanted to conquer other places?
No, absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Because that's the impression a lot of people would have, that Western cultures had a tendency to go out, to reach out, to go to new places, you know, and expand. That is almost with a connotation of, you know, inviting confrontation or starting confrontation.
You're right. I think that a very old tendency of the past centuries of Europe and Western civilization. I think now that the modern European culture is not so eager of conquering other culture. Absolutely not. I think it's the contrary. It's absolutely the contrary. We are eager to understand the others, the other culture, and to confront with them. That is a very a common, widespread sense, I think also in ordinary people, not only in academics.
Well, that's I mean, that would be great if that is the case, and I believe you also have a good point there. I just wanted to be the devil's advocate. But Professor Zhang, let's come to now and today when we talk about this topic. For a lot of people, this may sound very far-fetched. Either talking about faraway lands or people or works, or talk about ancient words. Why now? Why are we looking into classics for clues to solving today's problem? Can we really find clues?
Well, I think as the society become more and more industrialized, actually we need more ancient wisdom because we have encountered a lot of problems. For example, the division of labor. In today's world, the division of labor has become, more and more more advanced. But then, this will cut off. This will cut your knowledge, the picture of knowledge into pieces. So everyone is capable of one profession, but without knowing the knowledge of others. And this will bring a challenge to your own development of your personality. So then classics will tell us that you always look at, how to develop personality fully, comprehensive. And also, for example, now we have the challenge of technologies like AI. AI is shaping our society dramatically. So how could we manage development of AI? Then we have to go back to the wisdom of classics to see whether those arts, has an ethical purpose, and to always use this ethical target to manage those technology. And also in terms of question like peace and war and political order, I think there's always the concern about whether this material expansion, those expansion of glory, those honor, those discussion of all these things can truly lead to the human happiness. So I think the classical wisdom always ask, what is the real purpose of human life? Whether this kind of today's like militarism, those discussion about the political civilization, those kinds of really can bring us happiness. I think all these are classics. What classic can bring to us.
Professor Zhang, I'm going to go very straight to you for one tip. Can you share a tip to our viewers as to one piece of advice, one piece of work you can quote, you can think of at this moment that will help people answer these questions?
Well, for example, as you know, China's sage Lao Tzu has a saying, 道法自然, 道法自然, which the Dao, the great way, actually follows the nature. So actually, this is really kind of discussion about, teaching about the relationship between our arts and the moral purpose of the words. And also, the Chinese sages always talk about, like all under heaven, 天下为公, the whole under the heaven are for the public. And these are very important teaching about, how to avoid war and how to bring the solidarity of human being.
Professor Hans van Es, do you think these examples that Professor Zhang just raised, do you think they can be understood in the first place by people in other parts of the world outside of China? And secondly, can they, maybe they provide a guidance, but can they really be actionable? Because it's very easy to say there's a broad philosophy, but when you put it in your action, even I as a Chinese person can find it a bit, where do I start?
Yeah. Well, I actually think these texts can be understood, but we sinologists have to work hard in order to present them in a way that they can be understood, because the way how previous translators transported Chinese ideas do not really conform to the reading habits of today's public, and that is a problem. But I would like to add something else which I think is important. I do think that classical studies is not so much about these eternal wisdoms that you can learn. They are important too, and you will find them from time to time when reading these classics. But the important thing about classics, the study of classics, is that it trains you to do critical thinking. And that is the resource that human beings are most needing right now, I think. In the age of AI, when the internet can provide you easy solutions for any problem, right now it's important to know that to study a classic is something that trains your brain and that shows you that there are different solutions to many different things. I've been studying the Chinese classic Mengzi for the last 6 or so months, once again, Mencius in Latin, and I always considered this text in prior times to be an easy text. Now that I have been studying it closely, I found out there is not one single sentence in it which is easy. It's difficult to understand. These eternal wisdoms often turn out to be something that is not so easy to understand. There are some sentences that seem to be quite clear, but on a second
So you have to think.
you realize they are actually very difficult and there's a second meaning behind it. And that is something you have to find out. And I think this is something, with all the experience that I now have with AI does not tell you, because AI usually gives you some conservative solutions, which are very good for a first reading. The second reading is the interesting one. And this is something that modern human beings should learn and should not forget. That is my message to the world for on the reading of
Fascinating. Professor Piras, once again, we talk a lot about Chinese civilization or other non-Western civilization, but should people also go back to the Greek and Roman classics and look for inspirations to solving their today's problems?
Yeah, the point is that, as the colleagues have already said, there is a lot of example of wisdom, of critical thinking about the world and about the human being that ancient classics left to us. They gave us a lot of example of these reflections, philosophers, but also thinkers, but also writers. A lot of Greek and Roman writers talked about human being, critical points, critical issues of human being. So that is very important, I think, for modern people, for contemporary people, to read ancient authors thinking and writing about the same problems the modern people have. So it's important, the critical thinking, and this distance, chronological distance, it's very important because it learns to us to think historically, and so to increase our critical thinking.
Well, these are very big topics and we have very limited time.
Yeah.
So again, very actionable tips. If someone is interested in start re-engaging with classics, both in Chinese or in other languages, Professor Zhang and then Professor Hans van Es and Professor Piras, each one quick tip. Where should they start and what they should not do?
I think our experience of studying Chinese classics is actually we start from poetry. So like, the ancient Chinese, the Shi Jing, when we are very small children, so actually we starting with the poetry, we learn what is beautiful, and then from what is beautiful, and then we begin to think about, what is right, what is just, and then we will reading for other Confucian classics. And
What
then
should they
when
not
we
do?
getting older,
What should they not do?
well, what they should not do is that, simply like in today's world, because you have the AI, then you ask the AI what kind of ideas are in these texts, then AI simply give you a very simple answer. Just as the professor says, those answers tend to be very conservative, tend to be very simple, and it really,
Okay.
I
understand
you.
Yeah, I got you. Professor Hans van Es, please don't repeat the answer about the AI.
No, I would. I think that. I mean, I'm talking as a sinologist who wants to make the Western reader know Chinese important texts, and so I think what people should start with are the Sushu, the four books that were put together by Zhu Xi in the 12th century
They're
as the
already
most
quite
important.
advanced, though. They're already quite
They are
advanced.
they are quite advanced, but I guess if there are good translations of them, then start by reading one of them. Don't read too much. It's too difficult to do this. So maybe it's better to just start with the Lunyu, the Confucian Analects, and try to understand what these chapters try to tell people, because this is what East Asian readers have been trained with for a couple of hundreds of years. And I think we should at least get this.
All
And the
right.
second book then should be one Chinese novel. They tend to be very long, and that is difficult for Western readers to understand. The Shuiho Zhuan, the
Outlaws of the Marsh.
yes, exactly, because this is something in a novel in which there are many day-to-day things that
Okay.
Chinese would immediately understand, and Western readers don't know
All right.
them.
What should they not do?
I think they should not read what the Jesuits called, or what James Legge called, the Chinese classics. These are the Wujing, the five canonical scriptures. They are way too difficult, and one will not so well understand what China is all
Yeah.
about. This is something for advanced readers, and comes in a second step.
Good. One step at a time. Finally, Professor Piras.
I would suggest to read one of Greek or Latin classics, for instance, Homer, or Roman poets like Virgil, Horace, Catullus. That would be very pleasant to read. But I suggest to read that, and this is your second question, to read that on book and not on PC, because you have to think about, to reflect about that. So you have to take your time. And so I suggest to buy or to loan a book and to read them in translation, obviously, but directly in books and not by PC.
Classics in a classical way. Can I say this?
Right. You are right. You're
All
right.
right. Thank you so much. We have to leave it there. I personally am fascinated by this topic, honestly. But that's all the time we have for today. Many thanks to Professor Zhang Yongle, Associate Professor of Law at Peking University and Academic Advisor at the Center for Classical and Medieval Studies. From Munich, Germany, Professor Hans van Es, former Vice President and Chair of Sinology at the University of Munich, and Giorgio Piras, full Professor of Classical Philosophy in the Department of Ancient Sciences at Sapienza University of Rome. Thank you all so much. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X and YouTube using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.